Welcome to The Other 51, the podcast where your favorite writers come on to talk about their work, their craft, and everything in between. My name is Brian Moritz. Thank you for listening on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. My guest this month is a professor at Marist College and the author of the truly excellent new book, The Long Game, U.S. Men's Soccer and its Savage 4-Decade Journey to the Top or Thereabouts. That is a mouthful of a title, but it makes sense. Leander Schaerlaeckens, welcome back to the program. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I'm pleased to be back. It's been a while.
It has been. I'm looking forward to talking about this book. And just for transparency for everyone who's listening, we're recording this mid-June, and you're gonna be listening to it the first week of July. So a lot of World Cup stuff will have happened between the time that we're talking and the time that you're listening, and who knows where the U.S. men's team will end up. But U.S. won its first game in impressive fashion right when your book about the U.S. men's team came out. So that had to have been a nice little boost for you.
That was pleasing, yeah, because I got to say it was pretty nerve-wracking to realize that, you've got this book timed to the World Cup, obviously, and it's really the story about the larger history of the national team, but it also profiles a half dozen of the players who are on the team now. I was very grateful and relieved that they made it to the team because I had to pick my profile subjects right around the 2022 World Cup. So, and it looked iffy for a while with a few of them, whether they were going to be healthy, whether they were going to be on the team, and so on. So I went 6 for 6, which was very satisfying. And it's strange writing about a live subject and writing about a story that's ongoing and ongoing. The first draft of the book was basically done when U.S. Soccer fired its men's national team head coach Greg Berhalter and replaced him with Mauricio Pochettino. Happily, Pochettino is a great subject, less so as an interview and more so as just an incredibly rich character. So it worked out, but I had to go back to the drawing board and do a bunch of rewriting and repositioning of chapters.
So it's a wonderful book. I think I told you I'm relatively new to the world of kind of watching high level soccer with any kind of regularity. So I learned a lot kind of about not just the U.S. national team, but about like the history of soccer and like the relationship between national
Hmm.
teams and the Premier League teams or the La Liga teams. And I think one of the interesting things I learned was you point out a few times that soccer is really like it's not a brute force strength game. Like the athletes are obviously incredibly physically gifted and talented, but it is really about that strategy of like finding the like one little sliver of open space and taking advantage of it. So that was just something really cool that I picked up on it. What are some of the things that kind of big picture, and then we'll get into the writing of it, that you hope that people learn or take away from reading this book?
Well, thank you for the kind words. And to your point, soccer does look kind of like a track meet in a lot of ways. Like it's a lot of running and jumping and sliding and shooting, but really what it is a big dance for space on this blank canvas. And that's the reason that it's attracted. Like some soccer coaches are really, really, really bright. And not to say that, people in sports generally aren't, but like they could be spending that brain power on lots of different things, but instead they devote it to like solving these puzzles on the soccer field, because it's just constantly reinventing itself and evolving in different ways. What I'd like people to take away from the book is just how weird and wacky the US national team's history is and how kind of miraculous it is in a sporting sense where they are now. Because, from 1950 to 1990, this program almost didn't exist. Like it was completely irrelevant. They once went 11 years without winning a game. They would show up, this was in the 50s and 60s, they would show up to World Cup qualifiers. These are really important games, sometimes without uniforms, often without a coach. They would assemble the day before a game if they were lucky. Sometimes it was the day of a game. Like they wouldn't have any practices together. There was one cycle where they actually had two coaches and nobody could figure out who was in charge. They once turned up to a World Cup qualifier without enough players to field a full team, and they had to pull a guy from the stands just to make up the numbers so they had 11 players ready to go. I mean, this is a completely unserious program. And so making it back to the World Cup by 1990, just 7 years after they did this wacky experiment where they entered the national team in the old North American Soccer League, which by then was crumbling Pelé was long gone, Beckenbauer, George Best, Johan Cruyff, all these sort of superstars that had played in the league, they weren't around anymore. And so in a bid to save both the national team and the league, they came up with this thing they call Team America, which was basically the national team as a club team in the league. And it was just catastrophic. Most of the national team's leading players wanted no part of it. They came dead last. They scored the fewest goals. But only 7 years after that, they're back at the World Cup, which is amazing. And by 1994, they've survived the group stage and actually made it to the knockout rounds of the World Cup, which is to say that they were in the best 16 teams out of what is now 211 member federations in FIFA, and therefore 211 national teams. And by 2002, they've made it back to the quarterfinals. So just the ascent of this team to a place where they are now, and as you say, this might look terribly aged by the time this episode drops. But early on in this tournament, it is looking like they could go on a run and they could do something. Maybe another quarterfinal. Who knows? Maybe more. And just to have done that in the span of 4 decades is kind of insane.
So my two favorite random soccer facts. One wasn't in the book, but one is. My favorite random soccer fact is that an entire NBA basketball court fits within the penalty box area of a soccer field. So it's like to your point of how it looks like the physicality and the space of these games is insane. But I think one of the interesting things I found on this, and I've seen this elsewhere, but it really learned it in your book. In all the years, there's only 8 countries who've ever won the World Cup, and that just feels. I know it's every 4 years, and it's I don't know, from the 20s or 30s when it started, but that is a shockingly low number
Yeah.
of countries to have won this. So getting into the book itself. So you've been writing about and covering soccer for years. How did you come to kind of write this book? Like, how did this idea come to you as a book form?
So when the US missed the 2018 World Cup, which was the first one they'd missed since 1986, sort of this cataclysm in American soccer. On the men's side, we should always qualify because things are very different on the women's side, for the better, obviously. Um, it was clear that the sort of old generation that wasn't quite up to it anymore was just going to get wiped away, and that all these prospects that we'd been hearing about for years, Christian Pulisic by this point was already on the national team and clearly its best player. Um, and so, a few months later, Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams make their national team debuts, on a sort of friendly in Portugal when nobody was watching. If I recall correctly, one reporter made it to that game, whereas usually a national team, a US game would be covered even on the road by, a good two, 3 dozen reporters. Um, and so there was clearly something different about this generation and something more promising and something unprecedented. It was more pedigreed, it was more talented than any before it. They were playing for all these big European clubs, even as teenagers. Um, but I actually, considered writing about that team early on, but it wasn't quite ready, wasn't quite clear where it was going to go. And then by the time they were starting to have success and starting to show that they were the real deal. My agent David Patterson reached out, and who is now my agent, said, "Hey, do you think there's a book here?" And the time sort of felt right. And so we took it to Viking, one of the, great publishing houses in the US, and they were into it. And so that's really how the book came together. So the the long and short of it, an agent reached out.
So I'm you mentioned in the back of the book that a piece you did for the Ringer on Greg Berhalter was kind of one of the starting points for a project like for this project.
Yeah.
As someone who is kind of living this himself, so this is personal advice as well as general advice. But you have a magazine piece and it kind of spurs bigger aspirations and spurs a bigger story. So what is that kind of extrapolation process out? Like what's that relationship between that first piece on Berhalter and then how did that stretch into this isn't a book about him, but how is that a jumping off piece for what became the book?
Yeah, so one thing I've learned is that by and large, agents find you if you have ambitions for writing books, nonfiction books, certainly. Like you just write, you do good work somewhere that somebody thinks could stretch to book length, which is to say to go from 5,000 words all the way to 90 or 120,000 words, which not every story can do. Like you can have a really great magazine length story that just where there just isn't a whole lot more there to dig into. Um, so once I'd sort of so I wrote this profile of Greg Berhalter, who's then the national team coach, who had kind of coaxed all of these prodigies into something coherent and cohesive, and a team that was starting to win things. And from there, I kind of went back and, I'd been covering the team since 2010. So by this point, by the time I signed my deal, I'd been covering it for 12 years. And so I really started to think about, okay, how do I want to structure this thing? Where do I want to start? Do I want to tell the entire history of the national team? That might be a 600-page book. I don't think anybody's picking that up, right? Or do I want to kind of focus? And I really wanted to, spend time on sort of the prehistory, as it were, but really focus on the modern era and how this turnaround happens from this like deep, dark place. Um, but then I also wanted to kind of focus on some of the characters on the national team because in something that is kind of both a blessing and a curse as a writer, these guys, Christian Pulisic in particular, they're a little media shy. Unlike previous generations of national team players, they're just not that bothered about putting themselves out there. And that's a sign of growth, I think, for US soccer that players don't feel like they have to be evangelizing all the time and they don't have to be spreading the good word about their sport. And they can say no to things, and they very, very often do now. But it also meant that they hadn't really told their own stories to the extent that they could. So, like Weston McKennie, we now see him as one of the national team's leading players, as someone who's one of the longest tenured players at Juventus now, which is one of Italy's sort of powerhouse blue chip clubs, and you know he came very, very close to not making it as a professional athlete. He was a late bloomer. He kind of got cut from a whole bunch of different teams. Um, and that story hadn't really been told because he'd never bothered to tell it, right? And like all of the sort of six profiles I did for the book, he his story was also sort of instructive for a bunch of other stuff in American soccer and why it is the way it is. So that's why I really wanted to tell those stories because they weren't just about the players, they were also about the larger landscape.
So that is one of the cool things about the book is that it's the history, kind of like the chronological history of the U.S. men's national team, focusing on the modern era, but also kind of you go in like a couple chunks of history, then you go player profile, chunk of history, player profile. How did you kind of land on that as a structure, and how did you sell that? Because I can picture that being not a tough sell, but it's kind of making it so it doesn't feel like very disjointed, where you've got history and then random profile, history, random profile. So how did you kind of work to meld that so it is as cohesive as it is?
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to hear that because my editor and I did go back and forth a bunch on sort of how to do that and how to make it like, did we really want to separate those chapters as like, okay, now we're doing this for a little bit and try to fit it together in some fashion. It was a lot of puzzle work and a lot of like trying to work out how to make the book flow, but also make it clear that, okay, we're taking a little break from the history and now we're going in this direction. And I think just giving these profiles, the backstories that fit into the larger narrative and where to put them. So, like the Pulisic chapter is about him and being a deep introvert, but it's really about sort of the decades long search for a potential male superstar in American soccer who could cross over into the mainstream. Again, male because we've been producing stars on the women's side on an industrial scale. But so the chapters about him, but also not about him, and the chapters on Ricardo Pepi and Tyler Adams are about them and their own remarkable backstories. Pepe came from the borderlands in El Paso and really wrestled with whether he should play for the U.S. or whether he should play for Mexico because he very much felt both those identities were key pieces to his identity and his personality. And just the lengths he had to go, leaving home at age 13 to move 10 hours east to Dallas just so he could play in the right environment. And in the same vein, Tyler Adams, after his mom partners up with someone new and winds up being able to sent him to the New York Red Bull Academy, even though that was an hour and a half away. Those chapters also really speak to accessibility, which is one of the big
Mhm.
problems in American youth soccer. So I wanted all of these stories to also fit into the larger narrative. So that was the trick, is to kind of thread that needle.
And in terms of the larger narrative of the men's team over, its history, and especially over the last 40 years or so, 40 years is a lot of history to cover. And so as you're kind of doing your researching and writing and editing of the book, how do you kind of, kind of pick out the events to focus on and what to leave
Mhm.
out, and also kind of a balance between the events that very casual fans are going to remember, like let's say the World Cup in '94 or something like that. You want to mention them, but also kind of that balance of not focusing so much on them that
Yeah.
it's not just a highlights package for people who already know that. What's that balancing like?
Yeah, so the when I was done kind of report, and I did a lot of writing as I was reporting, but my first notes document on the book, it was like 300,000 words of notes and quotes and all the rest. And obviously you don't want a book to run really much longer than 150,000 words, but that still makes like 500, 550 pages. And we were really aiming for 100,000. Um, so my first draft, I think, was 147,000 words, and we wound up cutting it down to what is now, I want to say, 109,000. And part of that was because I'd gone back and rewatched every single World Cup game the US had played going back to 1990, which is to say every World Cup game that we have footage of.
Mhm.
And like for each of those games they had played, and that might sound like more than it is because at a lot of these World Cups, they only played 3 games, right? Because they got knocked out in the first round. Um, and so I'd have like a page and a half of description on each of these games. And I wound up cutting almost all of that. At the most, a game will get a paragraph, maybe two, but it's mostly like two, three sentences, a short paragraph. Because what I realized is that ultimately, if I was gonna resonate not just with the hardcore soccer nut who probably knew a lot of this stuff already, but a broader audience, and make it accessible to people who are new to the sport, this wasn't going to be a soccer book. This is going to be a book about a weird soccer team, right? And about like this quirky history with all these strange coaches and these personalities and all these anecdotes of, brawls on the practice field and players cheating on each other with or cheating on each other's wives. I don't quite know how to formulate that one, but I think you know what I'm getting at. And just that was really the story to me, and so that kind of became the prism that cast all of it through. Was like, okay, A, is this fun or funny? And B, does this help further the story of how the national team got to where it was? And that helps you cut a lot of stuff.
You did 150 interviews for the book, according to what you wrote in the
Mhm.
sources, and you've got all of your research, you've got all of your notes. So how did you kind of organize all of those interviews and all that information to make writing possible?
I went chapter by chapter, and I sort of mostly did it chronologically. So I started with Team America, that 1983 team, talked to as many players there as I possibly could. And then, transcribed all that, organized all that, and then sketched out that chapter, pretty much wrote it, and then moved on to the 1990 team, right? And sort of the intermediate. And while I was doing that, I sort of did the historical chapters as I went. And so whenever I'd get the 6 players I spoke to, most of them I had 4 out of 6 I had one-on-one sit downs with. And so those were really kind of turned into magazine profiles almost that were tucked in there. So I do those by and large after I'd spoken to them, so it was still fresh. Um, Christian Pulisic didn't sit down with me because he had a contractual conflict per his agent, which is to say that he'd written a coffee table book, which is a before the 2022 World Cup, which is a very strange. I mean, it's shaped and looks a bit like a ream of paper, and it's full of mostly blurry pictures of his childhood, sort of interspersed with this long Q&A with a reporter where that doesn't seem to have been edited. It's a lot of, oh, so you like to eat at Chipotle, right? Yeah, yeah, I like to eat at Chipotle. Oh, well, what is your order? What's your go-to order? I was like, oh, well, I like beans and chicken and whatever. But so at any rate, I'm not bitter, but he couldn't talk to me, or at least not in a sit-down setting, because of that. So I had to get him in press conferences and like, mixed zones and locker rooms and media scrums and all the rest. And then Weston McKennie's the other one who didn't talk to me one on one, although again, I got him in other settings because he just couldn't be bothered. Because as I said, this generation has a different attitude towards media that the previous ones did. You even Landon Donovan and Clint Dempsey, they very much understood that to be part of their jobs. And, they will speak to you to this day. It might take a few texts to get it done, but um, they see that as part of the work of being a soccer player in the US. And then you go back to like the 1994 generation, Kobe Jones and Tab Ramos and Eric Winalda and Alexi Lawless. They don't say no to anything. They still, even well into middle age, consider it a part of their life's work is to, help the sport move forward in this country. And then the guys from the 80s, they were just ecstatic that anybody remembered them. They were just
Right.
so pleased that you'd called them and they would talk all day.
So it doesn't sound like Pusilla could be a good guest for the other 51 with that book. Then they
Probably not presently, no.
no. So you've been a journalist for a long time. You've been writing a long time. You've taught writing and journalism for a long time. But in terms of writing, you mentioned the leap from a 5,000 word magazine piece to a 109,000 word book or whatever. In terms of writing, what was the biggest leap for you in doing this?
I spent a lot of time nervous that I wasn't going to have enough material. So I reported and reported and researched and interviewed endlessly. And then I was like, oh, well, now I have too much. What do I do? So it was really, there's writers who kind of write up everything that they have and then cut and cut and cut. Who will start with like a 500,000 word manuscript. I think I saw Wright Thompson somewhere said that for the Barn, his first draft was like 300,000 words, and then he cut two-thirds of it. That seems an inefficient way of doing things, but we all have our own process. Um, so I was sort of selective as I was going through my interviews and the material that I had, and then just cut and cut and cut, and just with everything, your reader doesn't know what you left on the cutting room floor, so long as you're not leaving out like really key stuff. So I try to keep that in the back of my mind that, the messy process of actually figuring out what makes it to the final draft, nobody else sees.
Is there one thing from your cutting that you really wanted to keep or wish you could have kept, but just it didn't fit, couldn't make it work?
Yeah, so there was this long aside on Joe Gaetjens, who was so in 1950, the US goes to the World Cup and they beat England, which is still one of the great all-time upsets. And so Joe Gaetjens was this Haitian dishwasher working in Harlem and playing semi-professional soccer, whose family was under the impression that he was studying accounting at Columbia University. And he gets added to the World Cup team like 3 days before the World Cup, scores the goal against England. What we neglect to mention when we retell that story is that the US had pretty lopsided losses to Chile and Spain at that World Cup and got sent home after the first round, but whatever. And so Gaetjens has a brief career in France, and then a professional career. And then he goes back to Haiti, where a few years later he disappears because even though there was a movie made about that team that shows Gaetjens as like this voodoo practicing barefoot slum dweller, when actually he was from a really prominent political family in Port-au-Prince, and Papa Doc Duvalier, the dictator there, had the Gaetjens family, they were his enemies. And so at a certain point, he's cracking down on dissent, and the Gaetjens family flees except for Joe, because he says, I'm apolitical, I'm a soccer player, he's going to leave me alone. And so, nevertheless, he gets rounded up and sent to this notorious prison where most likely he was murdered a few days later. So that was a really interesting story. But it was just this long aside that was kind of dragging down the flow of the narrative, and I never quite figured out how to better integrate that into the book.
So we brought up the women's national team a few times, and I do want to ask this kind of as less of a writing question, just more of a soccer question, but I also can get to the book too. You know, the book doesn't really it mentions the women's team in a few places, but it's obviously very focused on the men. From your reporting and your thoughts, how much of a shadow does the success that the women's national team has had internationally and just culturally and is just so
Hmm.
dominant? How much has that had on the men's team and especially the men's team, over the last, as the women's team has become the juggernaut that it is, how much of a shadow does that cast on the men's team and how does like the men's US soccer on the men's side kind of negotiate that, do you think?
So we're the only country I can think of where the women's national team is more famous than the men's national team,
Hmm.
right? Canada may have a claim there, but it's the US, I think, that where the gap is the biggest. Um, And so that's always been a strange dynamic where Mauricio Pochettino was savvy about this when he was hired as the US men's national team head coach. He said, we want to be like the women. We want to learn from the women, which just isn't anything you would hear in any other country. And what's hard to kind of explain to your audience is that not your audience specifically for the podcast, like the American population, is that the men's and national teams have basically been on diametrically opposed trajectories for decades, where we effectively legislated the women's national team's dominance into existence with Title IX, right? It creates this massive pipeline of talent that comes through college soccer and feeds the national team years and years and years and years before any other country starts to take women's soccer seriously. And now the rest of the world is catching up as women's pro soccer is really taking off around the world. The men, on the other hand, are doing the catching up, right? They spent 50 years, being unserious as a soccer country and are trying to close that gap. So they're really, on the chart traveling in opposite directions. Um, Not to say that the women are getting worse, but the gap between them and the rest of the world is getting smaller and smaller. So that's a very strange position to be in. It also creates quirky little issues for U.S. soccer. They had this big equal pay fight with the women's national team, but the bit that was sort of not really explained as well is that the women's national team, for instance, was on completely different deals from the men. They got benefits, they got things like retirements and health insurance and maternity leave, which the men didn't have to worry about because they had contracts with their club teams that took care of all those things. Whereas the women at the time didn't have club contracts. They only played directly for the federation. So it created these false equivalencies that were really tricky for people to figure out. So it's really an unusual situation.
So we're coming to the end here, and I want to get you out of here on the question that I ask all of my guests. What is the best thing that you've read lately?
Whoa. Um, the best thing that I've read lately. I've been reading a lot of soccer stuff. Oh, I just finished reading this book called um I think it's called The Psychiatrist and the Nazi by
Okay.
Jack L. High. I think it's called. I watched the Nuremberg movie, which was okay, and then realized it was based on a book, which is much, much better, which is about the dynamic between um, Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe general, and the American psychiatrist whose job it was to basically make sure that he was fit to stand trial at Nuremberg. It was just a fascinating book. I really like that.
Awesome. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes, along with links to buy the long game, so you guys can learn all about men's soccer, the men's soccer in the U.S. That is Leander Schaerlaeckens. My man, I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
And thank you all for listening to the other 51. We do this just about once a month, and you can also read more of my work over at Sports Media Guy on Substack. Jen Moritz does our graphics. Ellie Moritz wrote our theme music. I'm Brian, and I will talk to you next time.